Southern Africa experienced the driest February in decades that wiped out crops and threatens to put millions at risk of hunger. The El Nino-induced drought has seen parts of Zambia, Botswana and Zimbabwe with the least amount of rain decimating crop output. To unpack this devastating phenomenon, I caught up with agriculture economist Wandile Sihlobo. This is how our conversation went. Wandile, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us on Africa Today. The matter at hand, obviously, is El Nino and the devastating effects that it seems to be having on Southern Africa.
It is very tough, Hugo, at this moment. And we always knew that we were transitioning into an El Nino period. But the start of the season was not as harsh as what we are seeing now. The season started around about October 2023, and we received really excellent rainfall on much of Southern Africa to an extent that if you were to look at what farmers planted in South Africa, in Zambia and Zimbabwe and many of the other countries in the region, the area was roughly the same as what they had planted the previous year. Where the problem begins to really intensify, it's around about February of this year, where in much of the Southern Africa region, the crops were going in what we call pollination or flowering stage, which is just before the maturation. And that's where the grain formation stages of the crop happen. And we began to see that it became fairly dry to an extent that right now there are reported widespread losses in a number of areas within the region.
Well, it goes just beyond the losses that are widespread that you speak of, Wandile. It speaks to absolute devastation in many parts and threats of hunger, at least according to the World Food Programme.
We just learned by the end of February that Zambia was saying roughly half of their maize hectares was actually failing because of the El Nino. And I mean, of course, then you think about Zimbabwe. By that time, we already knew that over 2 million Zimbabweans were going on to be in acute hunger. In South Africa, we're already recording about double-digit declines on the crop compared to the previous year. So, of course, then this does signal to us that from a household food security perspective, across the Southern Africa region, a number of countries will actually be experiencing fairly tougher periods. It's going to be a challenge with regards to access of some of the staple grain, but also the pricing is going to be a challenge. But all of this is something that we foresee that it may intensify somewhere around about the third quarter, going to the fourth quarter of the year, and even going up to an extent at the beginning of 2025, because you plan now, you have a few months before then all of this is needed. And that's where we foresee that there will be a challenge.
So let's unpack these implications, Wandile. Now, we've got hunger on the one hand. So many of these SADC communities or sub-Saharan countries that are facing the El Nino drought are going to have to import grain, right? And many of them do not have healthy bank balances, so to speak. So that one is going to be a challenge. The other, obviously, is the limited rainfall coming through, particularly where you look at the Zambezi, for instance, that then powers electricity in the Kariba Dam for both Zambia and Zimbabwe. What are the ramifications of that?
I think the first challenge we have to appreciate is that when one looks at the global grain market, you realize that roughly 95% or so of the globally traded grains is yellow maize, which in general that is used for animal feed and other industrial uses. But for what we consume as Southern Africa as our staple is white maize. And outside of our region, the only country really that is a significant producer of white maize is Mexico. Which means then that whenever we are experiencing the supply constraint as Southern Africa, we tend to be in a corner, and I think that's what is going to be a challenge this time around. Then you ask the question to say, what are the implications? I think the implications begin to be clear once we know what the shortfall will be, because as we speak today, we are dealing with a moving target here. Just in South Africa, for example, we're not quite sure what the actual harvest will end up being. And I'm emphasizing South Africa intentionally because South Africa is the region's largest maize producer. About 26% of Southern Africa's maize usually come from South Africa. The key thing that we'll need to do is some of the African countries then beginning to engage with the likes of Mexico as early as around about May in a number of the Southern African countries to say they don't necessarily have the financing to actually assist. And I do think that that is why it's important to start today to engage with the likes of the World Food Program to say, Zimbabwe, what can you do to assist? In Zambia, in certain communities, what can you do to assist in Malawi? So that regional interaction is very important, that the African governments must begin to work on that to secure the supplies for the region.
So speak to us about the conversations that these African countries are likely to have with the Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, you talk about the IMF, for instance, World Bank, because Zambia, as an example, had restructured its debt and was paying off part of its debt. But now those resources are going to have to pay for grain.
One of the key things that you will appreciate is that normally when it comes to food, private sector has to play a significant role, of course, on that. The imports and the trading and the processing, all of that tends not to be done by the governments, but rather by the private sector players. It is only when the prices of food really get out of control where a policy instrument or a program from a government may be necessary, which is why I was saying that, organizations like the World Food Program that take care of the cost of the food donations that are done in some regions, they will be necessary. It was exactly the World Food Program that came out and said, look, in Zimbabwe, we are now thinking that over 2 million people may need support. What would be useful then is President Mnangagwa's government going to the World Food Program and saying, look, we are experiencing this problem and this El Nino has caused devastation. What resources are there available for us as the Zimbabwean government to be able to tap into that? Malawi should be doing the same. Zambia should be doing the same. Within South Africa, I still think that the conditions are much more different, and over the foreseeable future, we should be fine in as far as the supplies relative to the region.
Now Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema has already declared a national disaster of sorts around this drought. So he's one who's right up there. We talk about early bird catching the worm. So he's gone out, and is he likely to receive the greatest amount of support because he's immediately said so, while the other countries seem to be pandering about whether or not to announce a state of disaster?
President HH, you are right. He came out at the end of February saying, look, we have a disaster here in Zambia. But what I've also liked about him is seeing him talking about investments in irrigation. Just today, earlier in Zambia, I was seeing him in the fields. How I see this in my eyes is that he has actually seen this drought, but he's now taking a leap of thinking about climate change long term and saying Zambia should have a certain portion of their crop. That means that increased investment on agriculture. You raised a point earlier to say, look, there may be funds that may be diverted and now needed to be more on agriculture. But I think you could think about the funds that are being utilized in Zambia as if they are utilized in agricultural investments, which may be part and parcel of them saying they are perhaps maybe reprioritizing their budget. But he's certainly one of those people that has come up early that may need some international assistance. But I think that he's also doing a lot domestically on reprioritizing the funding and also thinking about the long term. That's at least what as best as I can tell from the official communication that he's been putting out.
Just a quick moment to give us your insights into whose responsibility is it, certainly to do some of the stuff that President HH, as you said, is doing. Is it responsibility with the internal countries? Is it with World Food Program? Is it with the FAO, for instance, to be coming up with support to these countries about this is where global warming is taking us. So these are the provisions that you need to make now. If you talked about, we saw El Nino several months ago, right? But it would seem that many countries did not provision for it or did not take it serious enough.
Look, what I think here is necessary is that the African governments, they have a role to play by setting up the environment to be conducive for agricultural production to happen, while the private sector, they should be the ones that are actually investing. And of course, the international stakeholders from an information perspective and also in times of disaster, they can then play a role. What we need to do is to say, as the African government, how much can we adopt technology to assist us so that in these shocks, yes, they will be there, but to lessen their severity so that can you get the better seed varieties that can withstand some of these climatic shocks? like what we are seeing in South Africa, that the disaster is there, but it may not be as severe as what we see in some countries in the region. The difference may be around the crop varieties that the countries are planting. And I know many of the countries in the region have been unwilling to move forward on adopting the better technologies, and they need to be more open on that. The private sector, of course, is doing its own part within that investment. I do think that the early warnings and some of these international organizations, they can assist where they can. But the one thing I want to caution about in here, which the African governments like doing, is that whenever there is a crisis like this, you tend to see many African governments blocking the export, saying they are sensitive to the shocks that these disasters present to the household. But in the long term, they erode the incentive for poor African farmers to actually plan and plant and invest in agriculture. We should be adopting what South Africa typically does, which is called the cure for higher prices, is higher prices. But the incentive then, that the key instrument that the governments should be doing is to say, are there household packages that they can put in place to support their households, while they let the market to be flexible on the grain prices and the exports, with the hope that when the rainfall finally materializes, those reasonably higher prices will incentivize production to take off and liberate the African farmers a little bit in as far as the technology adoption, so that over time we are able to have a resilient agricultural system dependent on technology and able to provide a reasonably stable food for the region.
Wandile, before we let you go, let's talk about the smallholder farmers and those communal farmers. Can policies be put in place? What needs to be done to assist them? Because they will obviously feel the brunt of this El Nino drought.
I think for the smallholder farmers, some of the key things that we have to be thinking about is to say, in terms of the animal feed for the smallholder farmers, what can the governments do to support them? Because some have cattle, have goats, they have sheep, and I think those that will struggle there. Some donations are done by food packages or some form of income support where the fiscal space to do so for those households. But I think that you are right. They are the ones that will feel the brunt. And I think that they do need some assistance there. And people usually underestimate the smallholder farmers, but they are very important for household food security. While at a national level, of course, the bigger farmers play an important role for national, but I think in certain regions, you find that these smallholder farmers play an important role. And I think a clear eye looking at what they need will be important not only in South Africa, really across the Southern Africa region.
Wandile Sihlobo, appreciate your insights as always on Africa Today. Thanks for your time.